Hello, freak bitches.
The thing about the postmodernists, and I'm going to speak mostly about Jacques Derrida because I'll consider him the central villain. Now, he actually they make a point.
Explain who he is, please.
Well, he's a French philosopher, French intellectual who became quite popular in the late 1970s and then was introduced to North America through the Yale Department of English. And of course, English literature is one of the disciplines that has become entirely corrupt. And so Derrida was a Marxist to begin with, but that fell out of favor because it turned out that Marxist political doctrine kept producing evil empires, and even radical left French intellectuals were forced to admit that by the mid-1970s. You know, they'd put their head in the sand for 20 years, 50 years really, thoroughly in the sand, and made sure their ears were full too. But by the mid-1970s, the evidence that that was the case was so overwhelming that even a French intellectual couldn't deny it anymore, and so they started to play sleight of hand with the Marxist ideas. So instead of trying to promote the revolution of the working class against the capitalist class, let's say, they started to play identity politics and said, well, we can just separate everybody into oppressed versus oppressor, but we don't have to do it on economic grounds. And so we can call it power instead of economics. So that was part of it. And then the other thing, but the fundamental critique that Derrida focused on, this is really worth laying out, because that the problem that he discovered, the postmodernists discovered, was discovered by a variety of other people at the same time in other disciplines. So, for example, among the people who were studying artificial intelligence, since the early 1960s, it was always supposed that we'd be able to make machines that could move around in a natural environment without too much problem. And the reason we could do that was because the world, in some sense, was just made out of simple objects. There they are, and all you have to do is look at them and you see them, and that's vision. And then the complex problem is not how to see or what to see, but how to act in reference to what you see. But it turned out that the AI people ran into this problem, essentially sometimes known as the frame problem. And the frame problem is that there's almost an infinite number of ways to look at a finite set of objects. So the fact that vision, for example, turns out to be way, way, way more complicated than anybody ever estimated. In fact, you can't actually solve the vision problem until you solve the embodiment problem. So an artificial intelligence that doesn't have a body can't really see, because seeing is actually the mapping of the world onto action. And so that was figured out more or less by a robotics engineer called Rodney Brooks. But what's at the bottom of this is the idea that any set of phenomena can be seen a very large number of ways. So like there's a bunch of pens in front of me here, you know, and when I look at them, my brain basically notes that they're a grippable object with which I can write. So I see the function. Like if you look at a beanbag, you see a chair, not because it's got 4 legs and a seat and a back, but because you can sit on it. And most of what we see in the world, we actually see functionally rather than see as an object and then interpret the object and then figure out what to do. So the function of the object constrains our interpretation. But there's an endless number of interpretations. So for example, if I was going to paint that, paint on canvas this set of pens and try to do it in a photorealistic way, I would be looking at tiny details of these objects, the multiple shades of red that are there and the multiple shades of white and black, and I would decompose it in many ways. And so the AI guys ran into this problem, which was that looking at the world turned out to be exceptionally complex, and that's still being solved now. Okay, in literature, the same thing happened. What the postmodernists realized was that if you took a complex book, let's say the Bible, for example, or a Shakespeare play, there's an endless number of potential interpretations that you can derive from it because it's so complex and so sophisticated. So imagine that, well, you can interpret the word, you can interpret the phrase, you can interpret the sentence, you can interpret the paragraph, you can interpret the chapter. Let's say you have to interpret that within the confines of the entire work, then of the entire tradition, and then within the context of discussion that you're currently having, and all of those things affect how you're going to interpret the play. So their conclusion was, well, there's an infinite number of ways to interpret a text. And then their conclusion was, well, there's an infinite number of ways to interpret the world. And there's a way in which that's correct. And so the next conclusion was, there's no right way to do it. So you could do it any old way. And then their next conclusion was, oh, and this is where the Marxism creeped up again, oh, people interpret the world in a way that facilitates their acquisition of power. Now that's where the bloody theory starts to get corrupt. Because yes, a bit, but also no, right? Because, and this is why they're wrong. This is why they're wrong. You see, the world is complicated beyond our ability to comprehend. So there is a very large number of ways you can interpret it. But, you have to extract out from the world a game from your interpretation that you can actually play. So if the lesson that you extract from Hamlet is you should kill your family and yourself, then we might say that that's not a very functional interpretation, right? Because first of all, people are going to object to that, right? It ends your life, it ends many people's lives. People are going to object to it, and it isn't a game that you can play over and over again in the world. So when we're interacting with the world, you see, what we're trying to do is to extract out a set of tools that we can use to function in the world, because we're constrained by the world, so that we don't suffer too much, and so that the things that we need in order to continue can be provided. And we need to extract those out in a way that other people will, so that other people will cooperate and compete with us in a peaceful and maintainable way. So that then you think, well, we have to extract out an interpretation that allows us to live and thrive over multiple periods of time in multiple environments while we're doing the same thing with other individuals who are motivated the same way. So there's a tremendous number of constraints on our interpretations, and the postmodernists don't care about that at all. All they do is say, well, no, you can interpret the world any way you want. All people are ever doing is playing power games based on their identity, and there's going to be no crosstalk between the power hierarchies. It's not even allowed. That's why they don't engage in dialogue. See, just to talk to, like, let's say if you're a postmodernist, just to have a discussion with someone like you, you know, a heterosexual, what do they call, a cisgendered male of power, you know, and white to boot, it's like, that's an evil act in and of itself, because all you're doing by engaging in dialogue with that person is validating their power game. That's all. You see, and this is no aberration that these people don't engage in dialogue. It's no aberration. It's built right into the philosophical system. They regard the idea that if you're in one power group and I'm in another, the idea that we can step out of that group, engage in a dialogue, have our worlds meet, and produce some sort of
understanding of each other.
Yeah, some sort of negotiated understanding. No, that's part of your oppressive patriarchal game. That whole idea is part of your game. So if I even engage in the dialogue, I'm playing your game, you win. It's a complete assault. People don't understand that postmodernism is a complete assault on two things. One, it's an assault on the metaphysical substrate of our culture, and I would say that the metaphysical substrate looks something like a religious substrate, so it's a direct assault on that. And the second thing it's an assault on is everything that's been established since the Enlightenment. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed. That's the goal. To be destroyed. Just like the communists wanted the revolution to destroy the capitalist system. It's the same thing. These people, now you might say, well, does every social justice warrior activist know this? It's like, well, no, of course not. It's not any more than every Muslim knows the entire Muslim doctrine or Islamic doctrine, or every Christian knows the entire Christian doctrine. You know, it's fragmented among people. But then when you bring them together, the fragments unite and the entire philosophy acts itself out.
So you don't think that this is a nefarious plot by a few well-planned out individuals that have some sort of an agenda that they're going to promote this ideology because they understand what they're doing? You feel like it's what you're saying, that there's a bunch of different factions, a bunch of different parts to this. And it could be a lot of it is that people feel disenfranchised socially. They are empowered by their positions in universities and by these insulated environments and groups. They're intoxicated by the power that they have over young people and shaping their minds and imposing their ideologies. They receive feedback from these kids. It builds up, everything strengthens, they shore up the walls around them, and they push this forward. And then when they have something like this speech that you gave at McMaster's and they get to actually act, it unites them. It unites them, and this is what you're getting from this glazed eye, cod look that you described.
Well, it's as if it's like Richard Dawkins' idea of meme. If you imagine that in your neural structure, whatever ideas that you're manifesting are represented neuron by neuron. Let's say it's a web of neurons. Not any one neuron has the entire idea set. This is obviously an oversimplification, but you get the point. There's a network from which the idea emerges. Well, the meme idea is that an idea can rest upon multiple individuals, as if each individual is a neuron. And so, there are people who are more or less fully informed as to the nature of postmodern doctrine, and they're pushing it forward consciously and unconsciously. They're consciously pushing it forward and acting it out. And so there are individuals who are more representative of the entire set of ideas and individuals who are less representative. But if you get them together in a group, the thing that animates them and unites them is the common set of ideas. And those ideas were produced by the postmodern French intellectuals in the mid-70s, roughly speaking. Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. Foucault was the person who famously pronounced that psychiatric diagnostic categories were primarily social in origin rather than biological. And, I read Foucault's work. I think it was Madness and Civilization, where he advanced that particular doctrine. You can actually read Foucault, unlike Derrida and Lacan, but I just found what he was writing obvious. I knew from my clinical training that psychiatric categories have a heavy sociological construction, partly because psychiatry isn't a science. Medicine isn't a science, it's an applied science. Those aren't the same thing at all. And, a pure science is a pure science. It deals with scientific categories, like atoms. But an applied science, well, it's a compromise between all sorts of different things. And mental illnesses themselves are shaped by the social environment, even though often they have a biological root. The way they manifest themselves is clearly shaped by society and language. I didn't find his work the least bit surprising. I thought, well, really? Everyone who's a sophisticated medical professional, psychiatrist, psychologist, everyone knows that. It's like, there's a book called Discovery of the Unconscious by a guy named Henri Allenberger that was written in the 60s. Great book on history of psychoanalysis. And he covers the shift in diagnostic categories across time. It's self-evident. So anyways, there's all these French postmodernists. They were all Marxists. Most of them were student revolutionaries in France in the late 1960s before that all fell apart. And they did two things. They pulled out this frame problem issue, the issue of multiple interpretations, and said, well, there's nothing that's canonical. There's no overarching narrative. There's no real interpretation. And I already said why that's wrong. And then the other thing they said was they did this sleight of hand. So instead of the working class against the bourgeoisie, it was race against race or gender against gender. Unbelievably divisive. It's all they believe in is identity. There's no individual, man. That's gone with postmodernism. This isn't an accident, all of this stuff. It's not random. It's driven by these ideas. Ideas are always at war. Always. And we're in a war between these ideas. Marxism, we already know, was a tremendously powerful doctrine, and this is its newest manifestation.
What is the motivation behind the individuals that are at the heart of this movement?
Well, I would say that the motivations are as complex as human motivations are in general.
But they seem to have solidified into a movement, right?
Well, I think the dangerous part of it is that it's almost like a scapegoat mentality. It's almost like psychoanalytic projection. That's another way of thinking about it. It's like one of the things that I've come to learn, and one of the things I talk about a lot, is that the battle between good and evil, so to speak, isn't between states, and it's not between individuals precisely, although it manifests itself at those levels. It's an internal battle, a moral battle that happens inside people. And so people have a broad capacity for malevolence and for benevolence. And that's a terrible war for people. And it's a terrible thing to understand and realize. In fact, often when people realize their capacity for malevolence, if they're not prepared for it, they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So that happens to soldiers in battlefields. So they go out, they're innocent guys, naive guys, young guys, and they go out onto a battlefield and they get put in a really stressful situation, and they step outside themselves and they do something unbelievably vicious and brutal, and then they're broken. They can't take that manifestation of themselves and put it with like Iowa corn-fed, nice guy. And no wonder, because one is like a flesh-eating chimpanzee on a war rampage, and the other is, a relatively well brought up and polite farm boy from the middle of the United States. It's like, how in the world are you going to put those two things together? Well, you can't. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. And to treat that, my experience with post-traumatic stress disorder is that you have to teach people a philosophy of evil, of good and evil, because otherwise they can't recover. And I've had, by the way, in the last 4 months, I've had 2 letters from soldiers with PTSD, and I met 2 personally who said that watching my lectures had brought them back together, because they couldn't understand what they had become before looking deeply at their malevolence. Now, so I would say, with regards to this movement, this postmodern movement, the malevolent aspect of it, there's a couple of them. One, it's unbelievably authoritarian. I got a letter today from a university student in Italy. I don't know what university, but she'd been having kind of a flame war on Facebook with a social justice warrior, and at the end she recommended that this particular social justice warrior seek out a local mental health counseling unit and put a link to it in the exchange. And then she got a letter from the university. I guess the other person, the SJW type, turned her in, but she got a letter from the university saying that violated university policy and constituted harassment, and that she should seriously consider retracting it. And that future employers might be looking at what she posted, and it was inappropriate to put that on a public site. And it's like, I thought, wow, how could you be so clueless as a administrator, say, to think that your monitoring of your students' private utterances, you're monitoring it at an institutional level, and your intervention and threat at an institutional level is less dangerous than letting 2 students, troll each other on a public social forum. It's just, I don't know what to think about it. It's just unbelievable. It's happening all over the place, this sort of thing. And so there's the authoritarian element to it, which is I think it's a hatred of competence, because competence produces hierarchies that aren't based on power. I think it's a hatred of clear intellect.
A hatred of clear intellect, how so? What do you mean when you say clear intellect?
Well, you have a clear intellect, as far as I'm concerned. I think that's why you're so popular. It's because you pay attention and say what you see, and you're not too concerned about doing anything other than that. I mean, of course you have an agenda, because everyone has an agenda. You can't help but have an agenda if you're alive. But you can temper the agenda. Like, you can be clued in enough to try to listen and learn and watch and pay attention to what your own senses are telling you and try to articulate that. And that's what the logos is, technically speaking. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Jacques Derrida described Western culture in a famous phrase. He described it as phallogocentric, P-H-A-L logo, L-O-G-O-centric, phallogocentric. And it needs to be brought down. Well, the phallus part, that's male. The logo part, that's logos. Now, that's partly logic, because the word logic comes from the word logos. But logos is a much, much older concept than logic. Like, logos is... It's essentially, it's a theological concept, and that's where things get complicated. But you could describe it as the manifestation of truth in speech. And the postmodernists, they don't like any of that.
So phallogocentric would be the ultimate mansplaining.
Yes, exactly.
As it were,
yes.
Right? Like, any man who expresses or tries to correct a woman in any way becomes a mansplainer.
Or maybe to correct anything in any way. right?
Yeah, but particularly with like where the Ted Cruz, Sally Yates testimony that's been going on in America. It's pretty fascinating.
No, I'm not aware of that. I saw an example of that in an Australian congressional debate where a guy was accused of mansplaining by one of his colleagues and really like tore a strip off her quite nicely.
Yeah.
So what's happening in the States?
Well, Yates has just been pretty brilliant. She was fired by the Trump administration because she rejected this idea of what was the very specific thing? It was about restricting immigration, or about shutting down different people that are trying to come into the United States. And she had this debate with Ted Cruz where she, just brilliantly shut him down with, her knowledge of the Constitution and knowledge of what is and what is not legal or should not be allowed to happen. And she was fired for it, and he was grilling her. And his... he's a very smart guy, Ted Cruz, although I don't agree with him, and I agree more with her. The way it was going down, this debate was described as mansplaining because it was a man talking to a woman. It's just a recent example.
Yeah, well, I also read about something like that with regards to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because somebody did an analysis showing that the female Supreme Court justices spoke less than the male Supreme Court justices, and immediately attributed that to sexism, because you know how oppressed female Supreme Court justices are. So, I still want to get back to this, that the hatred or the dislike of clear thinking. Yeah.
Do you think that this comes from people, I'm not even sure I completely wrap my head around this, but do you think this is from someone with, they understand that their logic is muddy? They understand that their imposing of this muddy logic is illogical in some sort of a way?
I think they feel it.
They feel it?
They feel it rather than think it. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there isn't a lot of clear thinking on the side of the social justice types, because a lot of what they're doing is reacting at an emotional level.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're the best personality predictor.